discussing the sacrament of matrimony. Deacon Scott and his wife Denise they lead the marriage prep or pre-Cana ministry at St. Louis and St. Francis. And you're happy to entertain questions as you go.
Certainly.
You'll be recorded. That's what you're getting at.
That wasn't part of the deal.
All right.
Whenever this
I can stand in front of you. Please, Deacon Scott will tell you a little bit about himself. And if you have, please, questions. So, please, Deacon Scott Lancaster.
So as Deacon Frank said, my name is Deacon Scott Lancaster. Tell you a little bit about myself. I've been married to my beautiful wife Denise. We've been married for over 38 years. I can't believe it. We have 3 grown children, Brian, Megan, and Jenny. They're all married. Check. So that worked well. We also have 3 grandchildren. We have a 3-year-old Sammy. His birthday was just on New Year's Eve. My granddaughter Olivia's birthday is today. She just turned 1, so I got to have lunch with her today. And then my grandson Maverick will be 3 months old in a couple days. So very exciting. Love grandchildren. They're a lot of fun to be around. And then they go to mom and dad. It's great. We've been in Howard County for about 33 years. We've been members of St. Louis since that time. So we've been kind of grew up. Our married life kind of grew up in this community of St. Louis and St. Francis. So it's a beautiful place. I was ordained a deacon almost 13 years ago, and I've been serving here at St. Louis and St. Francis since my ordination. That's been truly a blessing. And as Deacon Frank mentioned, my wife and I coordinate marriage prep for this pastorate. So she and I put on a conference twice a year and coordinate, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in my talk, coordinate what we call sponsored couples. All right? As Deacon Frank also said, he took away all my thunder. This is an interactive presentation. So if I say something and it pops a question, please stop me and ask it. It's relevant to do it in context. So if you ask the question while we're talking about the topic, I think it'll make it a little more meaningful. Does that make sense? Any questions? Missed opportunity. An opportunity. So marriage in today's society has gotten a little confusing, right? For a millennia, for thousands of years, marriage has been the foundation of society. We wouldn't be where we are today without marriage. It builds the blocks. It's the foundation for all other relationships in the domestic church, okay? And where did it all start? Who started it? That was not rhetorical. God did. God started. God created the bond of marriage. And he did so by creating man and woman. Right? So I just wanted to read from the book of Genesis about how this all got started. God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and the cattle, and over all the wild animals, and all creatures that crawl on the ground." God created man in his image. In the divine image, he created him, male and female, he created them. God blessed them, saying to them, "Be fertile and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the seas, the birds of the air, and all the living things that move on the earth." He created it. He created man and woman, and he created them to live in the bond of marriage. Okay? The Catechism of the Catholic Church describes it this way. Don't worry, this will be the only time I quote the Catechism. But it says it very nicely, I think. Man and woman were made for each other. Not that God left them half-made and incomplete as individuals. He created them to be a communion of persons in which each can be helpmate to the other. For they are equal as persons, bone of my bones, and complementary as masculine and female and feminine. In marriage, God unites them in such a way that by forming one flesh, they can transmit human life. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. By transmitting human life to their descendants, man and woman as spouse and parents cooperate in a unique way in the Creator's work. The love that's in marriage is the exact same love that God the Father has for us. It's unconditional. And as such, because he created us in his image, we through his gift receive the ability to participate in that miracle of life. That in the bond of marriage, the gift of our physical ability to create, we get to participate in what he started. That's a great responsibility, and it's a wonderful gift in the bond of marriage. The spirit of love is not an act of love. There's a lot of confusion about that. That love is the act of a man and a woman together. That's not where it starts. That's actually, I'm a businessman by trade, that's a trailing indicator. The intimacy of the conjugal act actually comes after the spiritual intimacy that's created in marriage. Does that make sense? Okay? Okay. So, what does Jesus have to say about this? In Matthew's Gospel, which is actually part of the rite of marriage, Jesus said this: some Pharisees approached him, Jesus, and tested him, saying, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause whatsoever?" Jesus said in reply, "Have you not read that from the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh,' so that they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, no human must separate." So scripturally, God has defined marriage. God has created marriage. This is important. He created it. And if you are married in the bond of marriage in the church, the Catholic Church, there's nothing we can do to change that. There's a lot of confusion about that in the world today. And the reason why is God models marital love after the same love that he has for his Son. And that love, the love of the Father for the Son, and the love of the Son for the Father, is the Holy Spirit. And you can't break that, right? And so when we get married in the church, we believe that's the same bond. Now, I didn't fully understand that until I had kids, right? Because there is nothing that my kids can do that would make me stop loving them. They pissed me off a few times, right? But I still love them unconditionally. There's nothing that can break that. And I've come to realize that's the exact same love that a man and a woman have in the sacrament of marriage. There is nothing my wife can do that would make me stop loving her. She's not here, so I can say, and she's pissed me off a few times, right? But that's okay, because marriage is a choice. The love of marriage is a choice. If it was a feeling, that love was a feeling, there would be problems, right? It's not. It's a choice we made to enter into the bond of marriage, knowing that it's forever. Does that make sense? Okay? All right. Now, today, in the world today, there's a lot of confusion about that. I mean, I'm astonished at, I'm in my early 60s, so I've been around a little bit, but I'm surprised at the pace in which we've gotten where we are today. It's quickened, where there's a lot of confusion around what is this thing called marriage. And I think the reason why is because in our own narcissistic society, we think that we, as human beings, created the thing called marriage, right? And if you do that, what does that mean? If humans created marriage, that means man can do what? They can change it. They can change it. And that's what we're seeing today, is that society is trying to dictate what marriage is. That it isn't as God created it, man and woman, that we can define it however we want. All right? And I don't think we've seen the end of that yet. Now, I'd like to compare and contrast Christian Catholic marriage versus this thing called secular marriage, all right? A husband and a wife in a Christian Catholic marriage, they're equal in value, right? They're equal in what they bring to the relationship, but they're not the same. They're different in nature. I don't have to tell you that man and woman are different. They're different physically, they're different in temperament, and how we approach things. That doesn't mean our values are different. They're the same. We just have different natures. Does that make sense? And there's a complementarity in that difference. We complement one another. That's how God created it, all right? To be complementary. That fact that we're equal in value, different in nature, but complementary in purpose, is divinely revealed. It's part of the natural law. You can't deny it. And the reason why is because it's God's law. Natural law is based on God's law, right? And so if God created that, who are we to change it? Okay? But you have to accept the fact that it was divinely revealed. Now, what about a husband and a wife in a secular marriage? Okay? Well, it can take different characteristics, right? Well, it could be chauvinistic, where one has more value than the other. They're not equal in value, right? And you've seen that, where couples, one's passive, one's aggressive, right? It doesn't work well because there's not equality in that. They're not the same, but they're equal in value. Or there's unisexism, where both believe they're the same in all things. This is where we're getting this confusion about a male can be a female and a female can be a male. They're the same, but they're not, right? We're different, like I mentioned, all right? So that's another characteristic of secular marriage. And the last is, in order for a couple to enter into a marriage unconditionally, what does that mean? What does that mean? That means that,
By their own choice.
well, it's by their own choice.
No matter what.
And no matter what. But that means that it has to be sacrificial, right? And so a couple enters into a marriage, not inwardly focused, but sacrificially. Again, I learned this with my kids, right? That I understood what that meant when I was dealing with my kids as they were growing up, and all the things that they were getting exposed to, right? And may even act upon, right? What I had to teach them was that life was not about them. It was about them going out into the world to be outwardly focused, to be sacrificial. And praise God, it seems to have worked so far. Now they're in their mid-30s, there's some time, but I think they get the idea that life is not about them. And now that they have their own kids, they're seeing that. They're seeing that up close and personal. Individualism, it denies the complementary value of married life, right? Because you think it's about you, whatever you want. I want to feel good. And so the gift, the conjugal act, is about me getting pleasure. And that's not the purpose of that in a divinely inspired relationship. Does that make sense? Okay? Okay. So what does that mean then about the conjugal act in marriage? What's its purpose? Again, Eros, which is physical pleasure, that's a gift from God. But that's a trailing indicator. That comes after the intimacy, the agape love, the sacrificial love. Does that make sense? You have to have that first in order for the eros, the lust, the gift of conjugal act in a marriage. You have to have the spiritual first. Otherwise, the gift is only for my self-pleasure. Does that make sense? Right? It has to be divinely inspired. And that's why we as the church believe it only can exist that way in marriage. Does that make sense? Okay. Any questions about that? That will make sense? What exactly is taking place at the marriage rite? We are our rights. R-I-T-E, rights, right? And in order for them to be meaningful, we should understand what's going on. Right? So I thought what I'd do is I'd walk through the marriage rite so that the next time you're there, you can say, oh yeah, I now know what that means. Right? First of all, a Catholic wedding has to be public. You can't do it in the basement of your house. It has to be public because there has to be 3 parties involved. Right? Who are the ministers of marriage, of the marriage rite? The couple. The couple are the ministers. It's the only sacrament in which clergy are not the ministers. They marry themselves. Kind of makes sense, right? The other 2 parties to that is the clergy. The clergy is a witness for the church and blesses the bond. Right? And then there has to be 2 other witnesses representing the community. They have to be named. So as part of the marriage prep, one of the things we have to do is say, okay, who are the 2 people that are going to be your witnesses? And I always follow up with, will they be there? Because if they're not there, they can't witness it. Right? So they might say, oh, I'm going to have Uncle John and Aunt Sue as my witnesses, but they can't make it. I said, we need somebody else. Right? And typically it's the best man in the maid of honor, although it doesn't have to be. That make sense? So that's how the church makes sure that it is a public rite. Okay? The first part of the marriage rite is the liturgy of the word, which we're all familiar with because we've gone to Mass, right? Or you will be familiar with it when you are regular Mass goers, right? So what's the liturgy of the word? There's a first reading, psalm, second reading, and then a gospel. And then a 45-minute homily by the clergy. Right? Just like in Mass. Right? In a marriage rite, it's the same. But what comes next is the most important part of the marriage rite. This is where, as Deacon Frank can attest to, this is where couples get in trouble when, with respect to the validity of their marriage. Right? The couple has to publicly claim a claim, right, in the affirmative, to 3 things. And they say those things as individuals. So they have to say, I am, or I have. They don't say we, because they're not married yet. And they're agreeing to these 3 things as individuals. Right? And those 3 things are these 3. Number 1, they're entering, let me get the words exactly from the book. You ask the question, have you come here to enter into marriage without coercion, freely, and wholeheartedly? What is that getting to? Marital love is unconditional. There's nothing anybody's doing to force you to enter into this marriage. And if someone is forcing you, then it's not unconditional, there's a condition. Right? And so, for example, I always ask, did Joe tell you that he'd marry you if you quit smoking or you pay off your student loans? Those are all conditions. If the couple show up intoxicated, they can't enter into the bond unconditionally. And I've had that problem. I mean, so I always tell them the night before, so there's recovery time, don't show up. Because then, if don't show up intoxicated, or we can't do this. Actually, I had a couple bring beer into the church. Makes me question, do they understand what they're entering into? Number one, unconditional. Number two, if it's unconditional, it can't be broken. God doesn't say, Jesus, when he got up on the cross, didn't say, if you do this, I'll die on the cross for you. That's a negotiation, isn't it? You get something, I get something. That's not what we're talking about here. If it's unconditional, it's 100% give. All right, number one. If that's the case, then it cannot be broken. Right? If you honestly enter into the marriage bond freely, wholeheartedly, without coercion, then the marriage bond lasts until you die. And so the second question is, are you prepared, as you follow the path of marriage, to love and honor each other for as long as you both shall live? Right? I am. I'm willing to do that. I understand it, and I'm willing to follow it. Right? Third thing. If you come into this unconditionally, and you understand, because it's unconditional, that the bond cannot be broken, then guess what? What's the result of that? The marital bond. Children. God said, go forth and multiply. Okay? That is the foundation of the church. That is the foundation of society. If we don't procreate as the domestic church, what's going to happen? Frank was talking about 85 million years ago, or 85 million years from now, someone want your sacramental records? It won't matter, right? If we don't go forth and multiply. So the third is, are you prepared to accept, listen to the wording, are you prepared to accept children lovingly from God and to bring them up according to the law of Christ and his church? It's not saying you have to have children. It's saying, are you open to that? Right? Because they are a gift from God. Now, obviously, if you're marrying an older couple, this is an irrelevant question. And you don't even have to ask it, right? So it's not saying you have to have children. It's saying, are you open to accepting them? Number one. And then what? Raise them in the church. That's our responsibility as parents. We are. That's what I think is the problem in society today, if you want my opinion. I'm going to tell you anyway. Is the domestic church has fallen on its responsibility of raising their children in the faith. Okay? Now, you know, my wife and I thought we did that with our children. My one son doesn't practice. My other daughter, she very faith-filled, reads scripture, but she doesn't practice her Catholic faith. She practices her faith, but it's in the Presbyterian church. And then my youngest daughter is my Catholic hammer. 1 out of 3. Good in baseball, not so much in saving souls. All right? So it's work, but that's the responsibility we take as part of the marital bond. Does that make sense? That's that unconditional love that a parent has for their children, which reflects the unconditional love that spouses have. Does that make sense? Okay? So those are the three things that have to be answered in the affirmative publicly, and I always tell them, proclaim it, don't whisper. Proclaim your agreement with that. And I talk about it a lot in preparation. Right? But when I prepare them and in pre-K, we talk about it a lot because it's important that you understand there's only 3 of them. It's not like 10. Right? It's not like the commandments. You only have to know 3. Right? But you should know them well, and you should understand them, and then commit to living them. Does that make sense? Once that is done, then it's that the exchange of vows that we're all familiar with. But I think, my opinion again, is those 3 questions are as important as the exchange of vows. They set up what it means to say, you know, when you exchange the vows, you know, I promise to be faithful to you, unconditional. In good times and in bad, unconditional. In sickness and in health, again, unconditional. To love you and honor you all the days of my life. That's that forever peace. Okay? So that, the questions set up that exchange of vow. I don't know if have you talked about matter and form? Okay. Well, now that I said it, I'll explain. So in every sacrament, there's matter and there's form. The form are the words. Right? You have to have both in order for the sacrament to be valid. Right? So in marriage, the form is not those three questions. The form that actually marries them is when they exchange those vows. That's the form. Okay? The matter is the couple themselves agreeing to live in unconditional love for one another till death do us part. And that you're open to accepting children. Does that make sense? That's why a marriage is not valid until it's consummated. Right? Because if it's not consummated, then they weren't open for life, open to life. Okay? And that's what constitutes a valid marriage. Make sense? Okay. And then after that, if it's so once that happens, they're married, right? Except for that last piece. And then it just continues. Now, if it's a Mass, you would have Liturgy of the Eucharist. If it's just the deacon, then you would just have a nuptial blessing, and then we're done. Okay? Any questions about the marriage rite?
When it says till death do you part, when that does happen, then is there like a waiting period where?
Well, I mean, are you asking me legally? Like in canon law? Church law? Is there, there's no waiting.
Church and common law, right?
I don't think, I'm an accountant.
Same
I'm not a lawyer.
Christianity law, or?
Well, the canon law, there is no waiting period, but if I was counseling the person,
Right.
you know, if it's 3 months later and they're ready to get married again, you know, then you have to start talking about where they are in the grieving process. You know, have they gotten far enough in that grieving process to understand, or are they just lonely? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I just didn't know if the death do you part meant you're just supposed to, you know, wait until you also pass.
Oh, no. What they're saying is that as long as the two are alive, are you married?
My wife just passed.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
That's okay.
What they're saying, while the two are alive, the marriage bond exists.
Right.
As soon as one dies, then the other is free to marry. There's no impediment.
I guess
Because the bond no longer exists. It was naturally.
if the bond stayed, that was my question.
Yeah. Nope. No. Nice segue. So let's talk about that marriage cannot be dissolved, right? Since God created the marriage bond, and like we heard in Matthew's Gospel, what God has put together, no one should separate. All right? So God created that bond of marriage, and therefore it's outside the power of the church, because the church is human. It's outside the power of the church to dissolve that. That's what the Catholic Church believes. All right? If you think about it, if two become one flesh, and one of the one flesh now leaves, what happens to the other? In a sense, it dies, right? And so when a couple divorces, which is a civil thing, the church doesn't recognize it, when a couple civilly divorces, a part of the couple dies, okay? Because it's effectively because of that connection with the Holy Spirit. If you take that apart, part of you is going to die. It's almost like you're committing suicide, right? Now there are other faiths that are more open to that, right? And believe that they have the ability to dissolve what God has created. Think about that. Right? I wouldn't want to stand before God and say, I had more wisdom than you. All right? That's probably not a very good argument. Right? And so we, the church, say that once you've chosen and you've answered those three questions validly, that the bond exists. And there's nothing we can do to dissolve it. It can only be dissolved through faith, right, as we've talked about. that gets, can a couple fall out of love? Well, it all depends on how you define love, right? Like, I used to not love Brussels sprouts. I now love them, right? Now, what changed? But who cares, right? Because that's a problem with our English language, that we use the term love to define too many things. The Greeks had different words that they used to describe love. The most basic love is what? Eros. It's lust. Like I can lust for ice cream, right? But that's a basic human type of love. You know, if you think about animals, they do the same thing. They lust after things, right? What God calls us and what exists in marriage is not eros love, it's what? It's agape love, which is what? It's unconditional, which means what? You choose to do it. Okay? So agape love, the love in marriage, is a choice we make. And if we have fidelity to that choice, then we can't walk away from it. Does that make sense? Okay? Particularly if we fully understand and agree to abide by those three things: unconditional, no coercion, and open to children. Now, the church has this concept of annulments. You all heard of that? We talked about that at all? So what is an annulment? Annulment isn't a Catholic divorce. It doesn't mean that you're going to file some paperwork and your marriage is going to be dissolved, like it would be civilly. All right? So what does an annulment mean? An annulment means that there was something in place that didn't allow that marriage bond to even take place in the first place. It wasn't valid. All right? And there are three types of conditions that would allow the church to claim or annul the marriage that didn't exist. All right? The first would be a lack or defect of canonical form. What does that mean? Well, if you choose, and you can, if you choose to get married to a non-Catholic, right, and you do not ask the permission, or get a dispensation, it's called, from the church, that's a lack of canonical form. And your marriage is invalid. Does that make sense? So if you choose to get married and want to get married at the beach, can you do that? Depends on where the beach is. Right? If the beach is in the Diocese of Baltimore, you can do that. But you got to get permission. And if you don't get permission, guess what? You're not validly married in the church. Does that make sense? Right? Okay? So make sure, and whoever you're working with, the clergy should walk you through this to make sure that you have that it's in proper form. There's not a defect. Does that make sense? So that's one. The second is a defect in consent. What does that mean? That one or both parties did not understand what they were talking about when they said, I come into this freely without coercion. All right? So they weren't able to give their consent. If they were intoxicated, they wouldn't be able to give their consent. Does that make sense? All right? So that's the second type of annulment. The third is a little less common, would be a prior bond or an impediment. Let me give you an example. If my wife were to predecease me, right, I, as part of my ordination, have said that I will not get remarried, that I have to live chastely as a celibate. That's no different than a priest, right? I understood that going in, and so if I went and got married after my wife died, that would be going against and that would be an impediment. I couldn't do that. I couldn't validly get married in the church unless I got permission, right? And for deacons, the only way you can do that is to go to Rome, and guess what? They don't give that permission. All right? They only give it in special circumstances. If you were young and had young kids, they would grant you a dispensation for that impediment to marriage. Does that make sense? All right? So those are the three types of circumstances or conditions that could exist that allows the church to annul a marriage. Okay? Does that make sense? Now, apologies, I was just talking to him today. He told me to make sure I mention this, so I will. And I have witnesses. If you are not married, but you're now entering the church, what does that say about your desire to be married in the church? I think it's important, isn't it? For those of you that are entering into the church this coming Easter and have chosen to become Catholic, it only makes sense that you would do that all in. And part of that is that you're going, and if you get married, you're going to get married in the church, preferably a church building. And like I mentioned, Baltimore allows you to get married not in a church building. Right? I'm waiting for someone to ask me to officiate at their wedding at a bowling alley. I don't get it. I wouldn't do that. But I've done weddings at Turf Alley or Cape. I've done them at different places. So it can be done. I just think it takes away from the nature, what we're trying to express in the bond of marriage. Does that make sense? It's a rite, it's liturgy.
Impediment. If somebody stops being a priest, can that person get married?
That would be an impediment, right? So a priest, a former priest, cannot get married unless that impediment has been dispensated away. And you can get that. It's done through laicization, and then you have to get permission from Rome. But you can. In fact, we have members of our parish community who they have gone through that process. Any other questions about that? Annulment?
Who gives permission to marry on the beach or other than the church?
The chancellor. So what you have, there's a form that the Archdiocese came up with that we have to complete. We send it downtown, and the chancellor reviews it to make sure that you're not getting married in a bowling alley.
Is that something new?
It's relatively new, maybe 3 years, 4 years old. And like there are dioceses around us that do not allow that.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to get married on the Eastern Shore, that's not Baltimore, that's Wilmington.
Is that something the bishop has authority over?
Yes. So after a period of study, I guess, I'm a little mixed about it. Is it an attempt at evangelization? These people are coming to the church to get married, so I'm kind of torn out. To me, if you're coming to the church to get married in the church. But, I understand. Yeah.
So, based on what you said, any marriage that did not take place in the Catholic Church is invalid. Is that correct?
No. That's
No.
No. But if you're Catholic, right, and your fiance is Lutheran, I'm making this up, right, and you get married in her church without getting permission, then it would be invalid.
So if you weren't Catholic and you married another non-Catholic?
That's a valid marriage. The assumption is all marriages are valid. Does that make sense?
No.
Not based on your expression.
Sure.
Okay, did you have a follow-up question? I mean, you.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of personal, honestly.
Okay.
It's just like there, cases like spousal abuse and things like that.
Right. So I'm not sure what your question is.
Great, because I'll ask you later. How about
Okay, great, perfect.
I have a follow-up question to his. So if you have a valid, non-religious marriage, pre-becoming Catholic, so you said like the church sees all marriages as valid, you did it within like whatever your religious
Yep.
thing was, you weren't Catholic, but then you become Catholic.
Yep.
Do you now have to do something, or is that marriage still valid?
So,
becoming Catholic doesn't
Well, there's two things there. Number one is, during COVID, right, there were a lot of marriages that weren't taking place, Catholic, because you just couldn't. So a lot of couples got married civilly, right, and then came back to the church and said, look, we want to have our marriage validated, right? And so that's called a convalidation. And they have to go through the exact same process as if they had never been married, meaning prenuptial interview, dispensation is required, pre-Cana and all that. And then you go through the rite. It looks very similar to what I just described. And then they would have a valid, it would be convalidated, it would be blessed by the church. Does that make sense? Now, if two non-Catholics are trying to enter the church, I believe their marriage has to be validated. No?
No, actually, I just did the research on this the other day. If the marriage is valid in whatever denomination or lack thereof, that the Catholic Church will consider it valid, and you do not have to have your marriage convalidated. But if you want to, you can.
Okay.
But it's not required. Because the church, through canon law, as Deacon Scott said, all marriages are considered valid until proven otherwise. So it's considered valid. You do not have to have it.
But you can.
But you can if you would like to have that. A lot of people do.
Would there be a separate marriage certificate?
The marriage certificate is issued by a civil authority. So if you got married in the courthouse, you would get a marriage license. You wouldn't get it. Like we don't, the church does not issue marriage licenses. It would be recorded, as Deacon Frank was mentioning, in your sacramental records, wherever you were baptized, it would be recorded there that you got married on such and such a date. But the license is the license.
There'll be a sacramental certificate given, just like we do for baptisms and confirmation. Bonnie has a little that we give, but it's a sacramental.
Yeah, it has no legal.
It has no legal binding whatsoever.
Yeah, I was going to ask, can you get the sacrament without having a legal binding?
I can't, I'm not allowed to do that. You mean, what do you mean?
Like, you have to have it, you have to have marriage certificate under common law in order to receive the sacrament of marriage.
I would not be able to do the sacrament of marriage. If you are not married, I have to sign the marriage license, or I cannot perform the sacrament.
Could you explain?
Yeah, can you explain why
both
that is?
bases of the Catholic marriage?
Well, one's in the United States, most municipalities have delegated the legal authority to the minister to sign the license saying that you are married, legally. Right? In Europe, that's not the case. So in Europe, you would have to go to the courthouse, get married civilly, and then go to the church to get sacramentally married. We don't do that here. They're one and the same. Now, I don't believe I'm allowed to only do the sacrament without the legal.
In fact,
I've been told I can't do that.
because when we do a convalidation preparation, we ask for your marriage license, your marriage certificate, to prove that you're civilly married. That's, as Deacon Scott said, we can't do it. But if it's the initial wedding.
Can you give me an example of why or when that would be?
Because I'm going to have to apply for an enrollment
Okay.
in order for us to get married.
Okay.
That's the context.
Well, but then you would have to, when you do get married, you would have to get another marriage license.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
You need a new one.
Yes.
Correct. And as Deacon Scott said.
From the state. In our example, in Maryland, it's the county that issues them.
So what is the average success rate? Like, what are the numbers? What are the stats for people applying for enrollments and then getting them versus not getting them?
Deacon Frank is our
I like
marriage.
metrics.
Metrics are wonderful, and actually, we just got them. They send them out every year to all of us that are on the tribunal. In the United States of America, our granting of annulments is well above the world average. I'll put it that way.
Without saying a number.
I'm sorry.
Without saying a number.
Right, without number. I mean, I think they granted 300 some odd annulments this past year. And sometimes we're not so favorable on the United States' stance on things. However, it is generally good. It's well above the world average. It really is an individual thing. That's why, if anyone is seeking an annulment, they need to speak to someone, and there are lay people that are trained as well as us that are clergy that are trained, to provide that guidance. And that's why, for example, the way I usually do things is I will meet with the person first, and we'll talk about it. and we'll get all the particulars out. And I have said, this isn't gonna work. So I would say it's not worth the time to go through the annulment because it's not gonna be granted, there's nothing here. Other times, we'll talk and it'll be like, yes, you do have these things. And then again, if anyone has questions about it, I'd be happy to talk to you in private about it so that we can get a better understanding. But that's why it's best to not just blindly go off. If you're St. Francis, there, Father Giascanis, myself, and Deacon Bob Smith, we're all trained as advocates on the tribunal. We can provide that guidance to you. And then there are trained people throughout the Archdiocese that can provide that. That's why it's best to just talk to someone first before you just wholeheartedly, just apply. Does that help you with your question? Yeah,
Mine, yes.
Yes. And does that answer your question about the legal piece? I mean, again, the United States, if a personal story, our niece is, she's a Mexican citizen as well as an American citizen. She's going to be married in Mexico in April, but she needs to have a legal marriage first. So she's going to the courthouse beforehand, before they get the church wedding in Mexico. Because there's not that provision in Mexican law. So she's got to have the legal document that they're married legally, and then they will be married. They will have the wedding ceremony.
Is maritime,
Go ahead.
if you do a maritime marriage, does it change?
No. That would be, again, lack of canonical form. Unless you got permission.
What do you mean, like on a ship?
Yes.
I've never been asked to do that.
That would be another, that would be
So I
something.
know the captain has the civil ability to do that, but it's not religious. It's not sacramental.
Mine was just so the date of your marriage begins in the Catholic Church, the day, for instance, I become Catholic and we get a validation. Because we were married in 2017, my husband and I, through civil, and justice of the peace.
And neither of you are Catholic.
He's a creative Catholic.
Did he have permission? I'm
No.
sorry for the question. Okay, so.
I don't think so. You want to know why? Because he still needed to go through the annulment process, which he did, and he was granted it. I can talk to you a little bit about it. So he got the annulment, so I don't think he could have asked for permission at that time.
And your marriage has not been convalidated since.
Correct. We haven't
So,
started
yes.
our marriage.
So if that needs to be done.
Yeah.
We can talk
Yeah,
about
that's
that.
fine.
But yes, that needs to be done. But
that's the date it would start. Or would it be 2017? I mean, doesn't
marriage,
matter.
you were married in 2017.
Well, if
Yeah.
you're filling out your tax form,
But sacramentally, it would be
I would stick with
Got
the
it.
day of the convalidation.
Fair enough.
So I had a question on like a sacramental versus like a natural marriage, because when I was like looking into some things, it seems like the Catholic Church sees marriages outside of the faith as like natural and valid, but only marriage between two baptized Christians is considered a sacrament. So I was wondering if you
as long as you have permission. You can, a Catholic can marry a non-baptized person with permission. So, and the clergy that you're working with will help you through that. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, about the marriage. What time are you finished? Time
Usually
8 o'clock. I just want to briefly just talk about the marriage prep process, particularly for those that are considering that. The first thing you should do is meet with a member of the clergy so that they can begin the process. And we're the church, we're kind of like the government with lots of people. And the very first thing that the member of the clergy should fill out is what's called a prenuptial interview or investigation. And it's a 4-page form in which the couple is interviewed. And the whole point of that is to get to whether the couple can get married, meaning they understand those 3 things, right? Unconditional, forever, open to children. And there are no existing impediments, like you've been married before, you were religious, you took vows, whatever that is. You're related, that's actually one of the questions. In canon law, there's a certain amount of separation there has to be between spouses. It's like 6 degrees. I mean, you have to be, that far apart from your intended spouse. Does that make sense? The clergy will also help you fill out any dispensations you need, like that we've been talking about. Like, you want to get married, at Turf Valley. You can do that. You just have to get permission, right? You want to get married to a non-Catholic, you have to get permission, right? So just make sure that you're forthcoming in any of the circumstances surrounding your relationship. It's always best to do that. Does that make sense? So that's the first thing. The second thing is you have to do marriage prep, right? So here at St. Louis, St. Francis, we have two avenues you can take. Number one is you can attend it's a one-day seminar that my wife and I put on in March and October. It begins with Mass at 11 o'clock and it ends about 8 o'clock. We actually feed you too, so it's not a bad deal, right? And we go through topics like communication, conflict resolution, spirituality, intimacy, and finance. One of the deacons who used to be here, who's retired, he used to say that and he was part of the tribunal too, and he used to say that when he met with couples that were having problems and wanted to split, and he was trying to work through an annulment, he said the majority of the reasons why it happened is because they didn't understand something in that marriage prep. They didn't understand communication. They didn't understand how to resolve conflict. So what we try to do is get the couples to talk about those things before they're in the marriage. Does that make sense? All right? Or you can have a sponsor couple where you meet one-on-one with a married couple, and the process is fairly the same. It's fairly free-form, right? The sponsor couple can kind of go down avenues they see in their interactions with the couple, right? So if they see, they have a problem with communication, let's pursue that. They understand finance, so we don't have to worry about that. Does that make sense? Now, a tool we have to help us in that is called Focus. F-O-C-C-U-S, right? And what it is it takes an inventory. Each couple separately answers 150 questions, right? And some of them are great questions, like, how do you resolve conflict? Right? Are you concerned about your future spouse's use of media or electronic gaming? Things you got to straighten those out beforehand. And there's questions like, have you discussed having pets? I use that as an example because it's silly, because frankly I don't care. Right? But what the point is trying to get to do the future couple have open lines of communication. Right? And so the system records the answer from both, and it compares them and says, you're in agreement here, and you're not in agreement here. And then it separates them into important things and not so important things. Right? I focus on the important things where they don't agree. Right? Then it also compares their answers to the teachings of the church. Right? So, are you open to having children? He said yes, she said no. Well, they disagree, that's a problem. And that is against the teachings of the church. And so it flags those things as well. It's kind of like a three-way look at the couple. Does that make sense? I think it's a pretty good tool. It's not a test, you can't fail it. It just identifies those areas that you might want to focus on. Right? And it's better to do that before than that after. All right? And then we already talked about the dispensations and the permissions. If two Catholics are getting married, there's no permissions or dispensations needed, unless you want to get married on the dot. All right? Then you need permission. All right? And then we already covered convalidations. So that's pretty much the marriage prep process. Any questions? Borrowed 8 minutes.
I'm really quick, just
okay.
Curious, the whole topic of matrix, getting married. And do they teach that in Catholic school, like more high school, like something?
I bet you if you asked, okay, but I bet you if you asked a lot of couples that were married in the Catholic Church may or may not know, what did they actually agree to?
That's true.
And they're living good, holy Catholic marriages through the grace of God. But I always think it's better to enter into it informed. I think it makes it richer. Does that make sense?
In school, Catholic school, there is a religious context to it, of course.
I went to Catholic schools and I couldn't.
Yeah, I don't think so.
I don't remember any of that.
Okay.
Went to a Catholic college. So
Yeah.
definitely. All right. Well, welcome those that are entering. It's great
Thank you.
it's great to see you here, and thank you very much.